Okay, good evening. Let's talk about money. How about that? It is Wednesday, and it's the 11th of November. We're doing another Something New at 7, and I want to talk about generosity. I want to talk about money. Now, I used to get really nervous about talking about money because I thought, what if somebody gets mad? Oh, no, wouldn't that be awful? Truth is, I think people are more nervous than I am when I'm talking about money. People get nervous about money. They get anxiety about money. Think about it. Number one cause of divorce and stress in marriage is what? It's money. And people have fear about money. Will I have enough? People spend money like crazy. Why? Fear of missing out. I mean, we have all kinds of anxiety about money, and we have anxiety about debt because we build up such debt. We have housing debt, we have education debt, we have car debt, we have credit card debt. We have all of this debt, all of these problems, and it just goes on and on and on. And the funny thing is, Jesus was never worried or full of anxiety about money. And so what I want to talk about tonight is, what did Jesus say about it? I'm going to give you some easy principles to learn about generosity from Jesus. Because Jesus spoke about money, he spoke about generosity more than almost anything else. And there are all kinds of great figures on that. I don't remember exactly what they are off the top of my head, but he talked about money more than most things. I think it's 1 out of 4 Bible verses. Jesus is talking about how we handle resources. So do you think it mattered? Well, it matters because we are so attached to things, to material goods, to money. And the wallet is always the last thing that is converted. So I just want to talk about generosity tonight, and let's hear what Jesus says. And I'm going to give some principles on that. I'm going to be speaking from a major story that Jesus taught about money. It's called the parable of the talents in some Bibles. A newer version of that calls it the parable of the bags of gold, which is a better, more accurate translation if we want to understand it. It's from the book of Matthew. And I'm reading out of the NRSV tonight. And so let's just dive into it a little quickly. And I'm just going to read a verse and give you a principle from it. But he begins Matthew 25, verse 14, by saying this: "Again, it will be like a man going on a journey." This is a parable Jesus is giving. A man is going on a journey who called his servants together and entrusted his wealth to them. And in Jesus' story, here's what it teaches us. Everything I have really belongs to God. God is giving it, loaning it, allowing me to use it. It's a gift from God. I didn't bring it out of into the world, and I'm not taking it with me. It's on loan to me. And it says how money and resources were given out. It says to one, he gave 5 bags of gold, to another 2 bags, and to another 1 bag, each according to his ability. So what does that teach us? God has loaned us resources. So principle 1, it all belongs to God. Principle 2, God has loaned us the resources, these things that we have available to us in this life. And what does God expect us to do with those? Why is the master giving these things to the servants? Well, here it says in verse 19, "The master of those servants returned and settled accounts with them." So that explains pretty clearly that God expects me to make the most of what he loans me. God expects me to make the most of what he's allowed me to have and to use. God expects me to do something with it. I mean, that's not really surprising. Let's look at what happened. The first servant that the man gave money to doubled his talents, his gold. The second man doubled it. The third man, here's what he did. He took it and he buried it. He buried it in the ground. And why did he do that? Because he was afraid. And the master's reaction to that was pretty interesting for a story from Jesus. He said, "You wicked, lazy servant." And here's why he said that. The man didn't do anything with what he had been given. He took it and he was afraid and he was filled with fear and he just buried it in the ground. He didn't do anything with it. And the principle that's teaching us is it's wrong to take everything that God has given us and to just bury it. In other words, to do nothing with it. We're to take the things that God has given us and put it to good use, invest it, make something of it, get a return on it. And in verse 25, he explains to the master, he says, "I was afraid, and I went out and I hid your gold in the ground." So pretty clear the principle there. What keeps you and I from using what God has given us? It's fear. It's all those fears I mentioned earlier. Fear of missing out is really big. Oh, keeping up with the Joneses, they've got it, I better have it too. Fear of, will I have enough if I give anything? What if I don't have enough later? Jesus talks about that often in Scripture. It's about trusting God with my resources. And all the fear and anxiety that goes with money and debt and all the rest of those things. We'll talk about that in a moment. But here is how the Master in Jesus' story responds to this man's fear. It's interesting. He tells the other servants to take the bags of gold from this man and give it to the one who has 10 bags. And the principle there is if we don't use it, we're going to lose it. And it's pretty interesting, pretty unique. That's not where you would expect Jesus to go. But what Jesus is doing is taking the resources that have been used, the investments that have had the strongest return, and giving those people more. And so what do you think, what does that teach us about what Jesus is doing with resources? What do you think God is going to do if we actually use what He has given us in a way that He invites us to use it? What is God actually going to do? Is He going to punish us if we do what He says? Or is He going to reward us? And that's really what Jesus says. If I use what God loans me, what God has allowed me to use, what does God do? God blesses me and rewards me. In other words, there's a benefit to obedience. There's a benefit to following Jesus Christ. God has given us stuff for a reason, and if we obey and use stuff, resources, if we allocate resources in the way that He has invited us to do so, God blesses that. And here's what it says in Jesus' story. Well done, good and faithful servant. You have been faithful in a few things. I will put you in charge of many things. Come and share your master's happiness. So what are we learning there? God is happy when we take what God has given us and we put it to work, when we invest it, when we don't bury it in the ground, when we don't have all this fear about, oh no, will I have enough? I better keep it to myself, or fear of missing out, I better spend it on all these things other than what God would have us spend it on. So the question for you and I, what are we going to do with all that we have? How are we going to put it to work? The big question is this: how are we going to invest it? And as you well know, God invites us to tithe. If you don't tithe, you can take a challenge and try to begin there. If you have debt and your fear of giving, you start with a percentage. That's what we encourage people in our church. Start somewhere and see if you can grow. Because God invites us to take all of our life. It's not 10% that belongs to God. It's like our entire lives. All that we are comes from God and will one day return to God. And this story teaches that we are responsible for what we have, and we're invited to use it responsibly. So here's some application on this. Invest in the kingdom. And at least don't waste it. Americans, if we're really honest, we're spenders. We're always like, well, we don't have any money. If you look at all that we have, and then look at us as a percentage where we fall in the world, we're mostly in the top 1, 2, 3% of the entire world. And then the second one is application is that the number one stress point in our lives is money. And is Jesus teaching that that is how it should be? No. Jesus invites us to be generous, to allocate our resources in such a way and to live in such a way that we can be generous. And so we hear a straightforward teaching like this, principles about what to do with the wealth that God has given us, and we get nervous about it. An alternative to that is to learn how to live in the way that God has invited us to live. And we have a class in that. We've run it for, easily over a decade. It's called Financial Peace, FPU. And a real cool thing is that for this year into I think it's through September of 2021, if you're connected with our church in any way, if you're a member, if you're an attender, if you're a friend of a member, attender, whatever it is, if you have a connection with us, I suppose watching our video would count as well. All of those resources are available to you for free. And then secondly, we're going to be running Financial Peace courses starting in late January. And we're inviting absolutely everyone to take them. And if you're past the point, if you think you're beyond financial peace, we're going to offer courses that speak into your life. How do I, at the end of my life, give? How can I be a philanthropic person? How can I be a generous person? How can I maximize the resources that God has put into my life? And that's the challenge before each one of us. So FPU helps us prepare to be generous. I love the phrase that's used. Live like no one else so that one day you can live and give like no one else. Allie and I follow it. It allows us to be generous, and I encourage you to be generous and to live in such a way to move toward that goal so your life is poured out like an offering to the world. So thanks for joining us again. This was just something new at 7, and it was on some principles that Jesus teaches us about generosity found in Matthew chapter 25.